War is what we call a global institution. A global institution means that all the society changes, and the rules that usually operate in society don't work anymore, and then there are new rules that substitute these rules. So it means an absolute change for all the persons, all the society that are in this context. It's a space where there is no middle position. It's black and white. You are with us or against us. If you try to be in the middle, then you are a traitor for everybody. And this means that somehow you are forced by the group to do things that you wouldn't do, and things sometimes against your own ethical rules. So in a way there is a kind of group pressure that is imposed to persons, to families, and sometimes you will feel guilty, you will, because you have to be part of the group or you will be part of the enemy, and this means assuming things that you wouldn't assume as an individual person. Also it means, as part of this black and white thought, that you identify your own group as the group that has all positive values, and the other are the ones who obviously are the evil ones, are the negative ones, and this means dehumanizing the others. And there is a fight related to who is the victim and who is the offender, and the two sides try to be the offended and try to justify the violence as not being the aggressor, but trying to defend yourself using the right to violence that you have when you are offended. So if you hear one side version, there is probably a long history coming from the past, and there are historical roots, so that you are the offender, that you have the right to defend yourself, and if you hear the other side, it's the same. So it's like that the history is built also to serve the purposes of torture, and you try to find a moral background for killings, a moral background for torture, a moral background. You have no other possibility but doing what you are doing. War means that justice is perverted, that the normal concept of justice is lost, and you realize that there are human beings that can perpetrate atrocities against you or your relatives, or simply because you were born in a certain place, simply because you have a certain gender or a certain age or whatever other reason. So it's absurd to being killed, absurd being tortured. It breaks the way that you understand how are human beings, and this is what we learn in the Second World War, what we learned in the concentration camps. The biggest damage was I will never be able to see the human being as I saw it before. So mistrust and lack of confidence become the rule. At the end, this global institution changes persons, changes communities, changes families, and sometimes these changes are temporary, but sometimes these changes are permanent. And the world will never be the same as it was before, and when the conflict lasts for some time, it can take generations to recover from this damage. I would say in the worldviews, in the way you see others, in the way you see society, in the way you see the world. And this is, you know, a subtle damage. It's not measured in terms of psychiatric disorders, it's not measured in terms of clinical. It's something, if you want, subtle in the sense that it's the way that you understand your world around you, but this impact will affect everything in your life, even when the work ends. So I think that the consequences are pretty similar in many senses as torture. Torture, when it's in a closed institution, like in a detention center, it also has its own rules and also change human beings, and the world as a global institution does the same. So I think that the consequences are pretty similar in many senses as torture. Probably the biggest difference is that in many senses torture is an interpersonal aggression in which you see all these elements targeted against you, and you face the perpetrator, while in war the enemy many times is everywhere and nowhere. You don't see it, and the target is you, your family, your community, society as a whole. So it's quite more difficult to understand and to orient yourself. There is an idea that probably most people share, is that children are more resilient than we usually think, and that provided there is a healthy environment, children can cope with everything. This is true, but just partially, and I think that probably there has been it's an idea that has been overvalued. That idea comes from the early works of Anna Freud, which studied children in the Second World War that were separated from their parents and brought to shelters. And when she saw the evolution of those children compared to children that were kept with their parents, she arrived to the conclusion that that being set apart of the parents was worse than the bombing, that suffering the shell impacts. So the idea was trying to protect children is a good idea, but in fact keep the children with their parents as much as you can. Why? Because to understand the war, you need a minimum basis of abstraction, of conceptualization that small children don't have. So, in a sense, they don't understand war. War is simply, sometimes even a game, and they see war from the perspective of their parents. So, the understanding they have is the understanding that their parents have, and this is for the good and for the bad. For the good means that if you have parents or teachers in a refugee camp that are able to explain the war in terms that the children can understand according to his age or her age, and can somehow transmit the idea of security, the idea that they will not be alone, the idea that there is a future, probably the children can cope quite well. For the bad, in the sense that if the family transmits a certain kind of ideology, in the sense that we're facing the evil, or that we are confronting people that can kill you for any reason, and transmit an idea of absolutely lack of security, this will of course be absorbed by the children, and the children can easily be manipulated to extreme ideology. So you can hear a small kid expressing ideas like, if he was in a very radical position, of course this is something he has absorbed from the family. So there is not a clear distinction between the good and the bad, the good is what my parents say it's good, the bad is what my parents say is bad. And so this is on one side. Resilience will not depend only on that, will depend also on how were the very early years of the children. Resilience is developed mainly from 1 to 5 years. When you are a teenager or you are 10 years old, well, this is already done, and it depends on the pattern of education. If you were you were grown with an atmosphere where you feel safe, where you feel that you could cope with everything. So, in a sense, it will depend on cultural elements. It will depend on the way that the family as a group copes with situations. And when we take out the child from this environment and put it in a different environment, then probably we are depriving him of very basic elements for coping with reality. So at the end, what happens is that children normalize violence, children normalize whatever, but unfortunately, this can lead to the idea that they are resilient to everything, and that's not true. On the one side, many times when they see images are the most dangerous thing. When they see images that are really shocking, these images will remain in the person's memory for a very long time, and they will express those symptoms that sometimes are very subtle. The most evident one, of course, is bedwetting, and of course it's having nightmares or sleeping bad. But sometimes it's irritability, sometimes it's fighting, sometimes it's, and you say, okay, there is bad behavior in this child. No, it's not bad behavior, it's the way to express the drama of images, the way. So it's images, it's sometimes normalizing horror. Normalizing horror means that there is a kind of dissociation between what your brain tells you, that there is a dead person, and what you see around, that nobody cares about that it seems that other children also don't react to that, and what is expected from you is not to react to that. But this is, of course, stored in your memory, and this appears as symptoms. So, at the end, it's the environment that will help the person to regulate. At the end is the school. At the end is trying to provide explanations for the word at the level that the person can understand, that the child can understand. And this has more to do with training parents, training teachers, that not doing therapy with the children. With children is more giving them a space to express all these things, and to put words to think, and to help the children realize that what he is explaining is important, and it's horrible. Don't lose the contact with the reality. This is horrible, and we call it horrible. Yeah. So it's like helping to organize the world, the symbolic world of children, and that not everything is merged. So it's about games, about symbolic work, about painting, about theater, about working with puppets, and these kind of things of expressing and working with parents and with teachers. If you imagine that you're in a town where there has been bombings, and then you want to specialize in working with children, of course you can try to detect children with symptoms, nightmares, irritability, bedwetting, but where there is children with symptoms, there is a family with problems, and probably what you have to do is to sit down with the whole family and try to see what's happening there and why there is fear that the children is not able to cope with, and then trying to see, even in the worst situation, how can you build an environment in which the children, true or not, but feel safe, and that's the best treatment, not not individual therapy, because you are an external figure, and of course it's the parents who have the authority to provide this kind of explanation, not psychologists, someone coming from the external world. Well, in the Istanbul Protocol, there was not much guidance on how to document torture in children, and it was assumed that it was like documenting in adults, but with some specific requirements. In fact, documenting torture in children is a very complex issue with a lot of challenges. First of all, in adults, we want to get a good account of events, and then we assess symptoms, physical symptoms, psychological symptoms, if there are. If not, it doesn't mean that there wasn't torture, and then we make a credibility analysis in terms of the account of the person is reliable. In children, the situation is quite more complex, because especially in young ages, it's quite easy to create false memories or to induce an account of events in a children. So you need to ask questions in a very specific way, in which you first of all try to explain the process to the children and try to that the children understands that he or she doesn't need to give an account of all what happened, and it's just trying to talk in a general sense. So it's a safe space, and trying to make open questions and trying to be very sensible, not to make questions that imply the answer in the question. There are different aspects that the team must decide. For instance, whether the parents are present or not in the examination. Sometimes this will help the children in the sense of feeling more secure, but in others it's embarrassing to talk about in front of your parents, or if somehow parents were related to the violence or are related to the perpetrator of, if there are elements of violence inside the family, or then the information, of course, there will be no good information. So there is a careful balance in which you need to gather as much information as you can before interviewing the children. You have to decide which is the best format, and whether the parents, it's better that they are present or not. Of course, when children are older than 11, 12 years, they can structure a description of what happened, they can use the words, but when they are younger, it's more difficult, and then we have to use indirect ways of getting information, and then there are different ways of doing that, drawings, of course, and talking about third people, like an imaginary family, and what happens to this imaginary family, or playing. And then there is a space for interpretation, and that's one of the difficult things in assessing children, that you can interpret what the children says to confirm your hypothesis. So it needs a lot of honesty when you assess children to be objective. Then you need to see which has been the psychosocial history of the children, especially the first 4 or 5 years and if there were strong bonds with the family and there were resilient mechanisms, then try to talk in general terms about the traumatic events, but of course not asking details, not being too specific so as to induce an answer, and then seeing which are the consequences. The consequences in terms not only of clinical symptoms, but also in terms of what has been lost. What has been lost in terms of education, in terms of peers, in terms of your normal environment of development. So it's not only the impact of trauma, it's the impact of all the things I lost due to the war or due to having to fight, or so what could have happened if there wasn't the war. And if the war or if the traumatic situation lasts for years, then of course there will be changes in identity. A child go through different stages, and part of the process of being an adult is developing identity. And developing identity means that you decide who you are and who you want to be, and you get this from models in your around you and what your parents or your significant persons show you. If you're in a context which is distorted, in a context which is traumatic, of course your identity adapts to this traumatic situation, and then you have people that probably during all their lives they will have damage due to this damaged identity formation. We can see this in people who are child soldiers, for instance, that they are submitted to this torturing situation for many years as child soldiers, and even when they are rescued, the way they see themselves, the way they act, the way has permanent changes. It's impossible to recover the child that was before being involved as a soldier. And then this is the idea of trying to document how is the identity of the person and how this identity has developed to adapt to the torturing situation, and then trying to conceptualize the change again, not as clinical symptoms, but as how is that person in terms of relating to others, in terms of coping with difficult situations, in terms of your life project, and so on. So it's not an easy assessment. The new version of the Istanbul Protocol provides some general guidelines, focuses on the environment for the interview, the person that should be present, and how to make a do no harm interview. So it's more about the process of doing the interview than on what would you expect to find and which are the symptoms of trauma in children. And probably this is something that should be developed in additional documents that could complement the new version of the Istanbul Protocol. Well, I would say that this largely depends on two things. One is the age of the children, the stage of development, and the other is the environment, the family, the school. If the earlier the violence happens, the prognosis is better. The possibilities that the children recover. So, for instance, a 4, 5, 6 years old children that is kept with her family and provided a kind of secure environment probably will once normality is recovered, will also recover. The opposite is when you have a teenager in a moment of identity formation that has no support, that has no family that can provide this environment, and then you have this what I call structural damage. It's the formation of personality that it's damaged because of the experience of torture or war. This is a lifelong damage, and the experience we have from this kind of situation, sexual slavery or child soldiers or this kind of situations, is that even the best programs must be long-term programs, 2, 3, 4 years, and many teenagers leave the program, are not able to end the program and go back to violent environments, or go to prostitution, or go but because somehow they have identified that this is the normal life, what they know and what they can do, and it's too much an effort to change all these things. So there is a critical age in which the impact of war probably leaves permanent damage.